Bitburg Air Base, West Germany 4 o'clock hours, October 1956. The air in the briefing room was thick with the smell of stale coffee and jet fuel. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness was absolute, heavy and cold over the Eifel Mountains. Inside, light was sharp, focused entirely on the laminated maps spread across the table. Major Miller felt the familiar, cold knot of anxiety tightening in his gut. This was his 47th flight over the border, and he hated every single one of them. Not because of the danger, he thrived on danger, but because of the sheer, crushing loneliness of the mission profile. He was flying the RB-57D Canberra, a stretched, high-altitude reconnaissance bomber. A single, dark, sleek needle designed for one thing: sit above the world, where the air was thin and blue, and take pictures of the enemy. It happened on a mission that should have been routine. Code-named Operation Scrutiny. Objective was simply to track the deployment of new Soviet armor divisions near the Hungarian border and verify the size of their industrial production capacity in the southern Urals. Book intelligence gathering. Low risk, high value. Miller was a lone reconnaissance aircraft, flying higher than any Soviet interceptor could reach. His cruising altitude would be between 55,000 and 65,000 feet, an altitude that made the MiG-17 look like a sputtering toy. The Canberra was protected by two things: altitude and speed. And if the Soviets somehow did manage to scramble a fighter to that height, pilot would be fighting compressibility effect, engine stall, and oxygen deprivation long before he could get a firing solution. The altitude was his church, his sanctuary, and his coffin, the invisible eye. But this flight was different. Tucked deep into the belly of the Canberra, protected by heavy insulation and pressurized gas to maintain film integrity, was a new experimental spy camera, the prize of the American intelligence apparatus. It was called the IDEC Type 60, but the engineers nicknamed it the Cyclops. It was a beast of a machine, a 66-inch focal-length camera with a massive f/4 aperture, housed in a vibration-damp mount. Its lens, ground from pure quartz, was capable of resolving objects down to mere inches from an altitude of 20 kilometers up. It was a camera so sensitive it could photograph footprints from 20 kilometers up, assuming the light was right. Most pilots didn't trust it. It was temperamental, heavy, and demanded absolute perfection in flight profile. Any deviation, a banking turn, a sudden jolt of turbulence, could blur the entire film roll, wasting millions of dollars and countless hours. Most generals hadn't heard of it. The camera was so secret that its existence was compartmentalized even within the intelligence community. Its data was read by only two specialized units, one at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, in Washington, and one in a secure bunker near London. The Canberra carrying it was officially logged as a routine weather patrol. Miller checked his wristwatch. 4:30. Time to go. He climbed into the cramped, cold cockpit, the weight of the enormous camera below him a silent, constant presence. Into the black. The takeoff was a brutal, extended climb. The Canberra was heavy with fuel and the bulk of the camera payload. Miller fought the stick until he broke through the thick, swirling clouds of the lower atmosphere. Then, suddenly, he was free. The sky above 50,000 feet was no longer blue. It was a deep, inky black, scattered with diamond-shaped stars. The curvature of the earth was visible, a glorious, breathtaking sphere of blue and white rolling away beneath him. He crossed the border near the Black Sea, heading northeast, deep into the Soviet interior. Below him, the lights of cities were pinpricks, vast stretches of farmland were invisible, and the world was silent, save for the constant, high-pitched scream of the jet engines and the soft, rhythmic whir of the Cyclops winding its film spool. The mission proceeded exactly as planned for 3 hours. Miller monitored his instruments, held his speed and altitude in the tight box required for the camera, and felt the familiar drone of boredom mixed with hypervigilance. But on that day, as he approached a geographically crucial, heavily fortified region deep inside Kazakhstan, an area the Americans had designated Zone Alpha 7 feet, the Cyclops captured one image that rewrote everything NATO thought it knew about the USSR. Miller landed back at Bitburg 7 hours later, exhausted but routine. The film was immediately removed by the accompanying security detail, sealed in a lead-lined canister, and rushed onto a waiting C-130 bound for the analysis facility in the UK. Miller, meanwhile, was debriefed, gave his standard, smooth flight, minimal contrails, report, and went to bed, entirely unaware that he had just photographed the moment the strategic balance of power broke. The photograph was rushed to a secure briefing room beneath London, where the light was perpetually artificial and the walls were lined with sound-deadening cork. The moment Dr. Eleanor Vance, the chief photo analyst, saw it, the room went silent. This wasn't just intelligence. This was a warning. And within 24 hours, the entire Cold War strategy began to shift. NPIC Annex, London suburb, October 1956, 11 o'clock hours. The work of a photographic interpreter in the mid-1950s was monastic. Dr. Eleanor Vance worked in the permanent, low-level red light of the analysis lab, surrounded by massive, clunky projectors and scanning tables. She was a master of the stereoscope and the micro scale, a woman who could detect a freshly painted truck from a mile away on a black and white image. The film from the Cyclops was unlike anything she had ever processed. The resolution was terrifyingly high, the depth of field almost unnerving. The terrain of Soviet Kazakhstan, a desolate, wind-swept emptiness, was rendered in sharp, brutal detail, despite the 60,000-foot distance. Vance was reviewing the final segment of the film, focusing on Zone ALPHA7. This area was known to house underground railway bunkers, but nothing strategically vital. The current satellite photos, low-resolution, grainy mosaics from earlier orbits, showed nothing but scrub and agricultural land. The photograph showed something no Western satellite had ever detected. Massive Soviet installation hidden under a camouflage grid so advanced it blended into the countryside like a perfect painting. The camouflage itself was a masterpiece of deception. It was a colossal fabric and netting structure, painted with a texture that perfectly mimicked the dry, brown-yellow vegetation of the steppes. From 20,000 feet, it would have appeared as nothing more than a featureless patch of field. But the Cyclops caught what satellites missed: a split-second sun reflection bouncing off metal. The ITEC Type 60 worked by taking exposures at such a high shutter speed that it captured the light at a near-instantaneous moment. In one specific frame, frame 47E, noticed a single, sharp burst of white light, not a star, not a reflection off a frozen puddle, but a geometrically defined glint. She immediately ordered the frame magnified using the electronic scanning microscope, a custom-built device that could blow up the image 400 times. The reflection originated from a minute tear in the camouflage netting, a tear no bigger than a man's hand. Through that tiny hole, the Cyclops had focused a beam of sunlight and sent back the image of what lay beneath. Zooming in revealed the true scale of the deception. Oversized construction cranes, not standard mobile crane, but colossal, fixed gantry structures, the type used for lifting multi-ton segments of high-rise buildings or ship hulls. They were oriented around a deep, circular pit. Reinforced concrete arches, massive, curved sections of concrete, clearly designed to deflect blast or radiation, lay stacked near the site. They were far thicker than anything required for a factory or even a conventional bomber hangar. The scale suggested structures designed to absorb the energy of an explosion far greater than conventional ordnance. Blast shielding, heavy steel doors, kilometers away from the central excavation, were visible, covered in thick earth berms. These were not doors for a simple tunnel, but entrances to deep, hardened bunkers intended to house personnel and sensitive electronic gear during a massive, nearby detonation. Rail lines leading underground. The area was fed by two separate, spur rail lines, designed to handle immense tonnage. The tracks did not stop at the edge of the camouflage. They plunged directly beneath the earth into a heavily fortified tunnel mouth. This indicated components of staggering weight and size were being delivered and assembled below ground, components far too large for any known aircraft or artillery system. Vance's hand, steady through years of analysis, finally trembled as she wrote her preliminary report. She did not need the blueprints. The geometry of the site told the story. The arrangement of the cranes, the massive central pit, the geometry of the concrete arches. It wasn't a factory. Factories are linear. It wasn't a bunker. Bunkers are lateral. This was a launch complex, one far larger than anything the USSR had publicly admitted to possessing or even developing. The width of the pit, the capacity of the cranes, and the sheer volume of supporting infrastructure indicated a missile of unprecedented size. The scale meant only one thing. The Soviets were building an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, the R-7 Semyorka, though Vance didn't have the name yet, a weapon that wasn't on any Western map, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead not just to Europe, but straight across the Arctic to the American heartland. The intelligence was instantaneous and catastrophic. Until this moment, NATO had enjoyed the strategic advantage of distance. The US believed it had at least a 5-year lead on Soviet missile development. Frame 47E had just wiped that 5-year lead off the map. The distance was gone. America was suddenly vulnerable, and the entirety of NATO's defensive strategy, built on the assumption of invulnerability from continental bombardment, was based on a lie. The room, usually filled with the quiet rustle of paper and the soft clicks of the scanning equipment, was now paralyzed by silence, dominated only by the glowing image of the impossible structure. The warning had arrived. Washington, D.C., the vault, October 1956, 2300 hours. The secured briefing room in Washington, known simply as the vault, was a place where careers were made or broken on a single piece of evidence. The mood, usually characterized by the cautious arrogance of the powerful, was now one of stunned, rigid disbelief. Dr. Vance's physical photograph, frame 47E, sat under a glass dome in the center of the table, spotlit like a geological specimen. Around it sat the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the CIA, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The CIA Director, Alan Dulles, leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. Dr. Vance, you are stating, unequivocally, that this smudge, on a single photograph, indicates the construction of an ICBM facility capable of striking the continental United States. Vance, flown in hours earlier and still vibrating from the transatlantic flight, stood firm. She had anticipated the denial. Her confidence was not in theory, but in geometry. Sir, the analysis is based on scale and function, Vance explained, pointing to the magnified sections with a precise laser pointer. Look at the cranes. The height and load capacity required to stack those concrete arches, which we estimate to be 5 meters thick, suggests a total component weight in excess of 70 tons. No known airframe or cruise missile requires that. But a two-stage rocket, carrying a large thermonuclear device and its own propellant tanks, that fits. The sheer scale was the key. Vance had spent her journey correlating the dimensions visible in the tear with known Soviet rail gauge standards and construction norms. The pit, she calculated, was approximately 35 meters in diameter and appeared to be circular. The geometry of terror, the components visible, the oversized construction cranes, the heavily reinforced concrete arches, and the deep blast shielding, were not just large, they were functionally specific to a new generation of weapon. Oversized cranes, the weight of power, these were not lifting beams for routine construction. They were designed for vertical assembly of a missile too tall to be built horizontally and too heavy to be moved once fueled. The missile was being assembled and tested in situ, suggesting immediate launch readiness. Reinforced arches, the shield of secrecy, the thick, curved concrete was designed to contain a massive engine test fire, likely of a liquid-fueled rocket, without collapsing the surrounding launch pit. It was a hardening measure, intended to withstand a retaliatory strike, or more likely, to survive the inevitable explosion of a volatile, prototype rocket during testing. Rail lines underground, the burden of size, the track capacity and depth of the tunnels indicated that the missile was assembled from large, self-contained sections, each weighing tens of tons. This confirmed the size was not merely strategic, but intercontinental. Only a vehicle designed to exit the atmosphere required such vast fuel tanks and such a complex build process. This isn't a factory, General, Vance said, addressing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This is an artillery emplacement for the nuclear age. They are not building a rocket for show. They are building a weapon of absolute strategic power. The implication was terrifying. The Soviets, by jumping straight to a massive, liquid-fueled ICBM, had bypassed the strategic stages the West was undergoing. The American strategy, built upon a massive bomber force B-47s, B-52s based in Europe and North Africa, relied entirely on the assumption that the enemy could not touch the U.S. mainland. The scale of the complex meant only one thing. The Soviets were building a missile that wasn't on any Western map, capable of delivering a hydrogen bomb from the depths of Asia to any city in America. The term ICBM, which had previously been a theoretical boogeyman, was now a geopolitical reality. The distance was gone. The oceans were meaningless. This single photograph, taken by a camera nobody trusted, had just brought the Cold War home, forcing Washington to stare into the abyss of absolute vulnerability. The next 24 hours would define the response to this new reality, a response that would become known as the missile gap. The analysis team, now operating under a level of urgency usually reserved for impending nuclear attack, didn't leave the reinforced bunker. The single, high-resolution frame of the Kazakhstan launch complex became their entire world. They projected the image onto a curved wall, using specialized optical instruments to measure the shadows, correlate known rail gauge widths, and calculate the sheer physical volume of the excavation. Dr. Vance's team comprised structural engineers, former ballistic experts, and architectural analysts. Their task was to reverse engineer the weapon from the size of the hole it was being built in. Engineers worked through the night, their eyes burning from the harsh white light of the projectors. They cross-referenced the estimated weight capacity of the cranes against the known density of liquid oxygen tanks. They analyzed the structural rings being lowered into the pit, calculating the forces they were designed to contain. The process involved creating a three-dimensional wireframe model. They took the measured diameter of the central pit, estimated at 35 meters, and the discernible height of the construction cranes, approximately 50 meters. By using the angle of the sun in the photograph and the length of the shadows cast by the girders, they could calculate the depth of the excavation and the maximum length of the missile intended for vertical assembly. The conclusion was devastatingly simple. After comparing the shadows, supports, and silo diameter, one analyst, a quiet, meticulous former Army Corps of Engineers colonel named Reynolds, whispered into the static of the room's tense silence. "Whatever fits in there is bigger than any ICBM we know." Reynolds was referring to the American programs, Atlas and Titan. The U.S. designs were massive, but they relied on relatively lighter materials and horizontal assembly. The Soviet complex, by contrast, was designed for a brute force approach, a colossal, vertically assembled missile. The estimates were shocking, forcing the analysts to abandon all previous assumptions about Soviet rocketry constraints. Payload section twice the size. The structural integrity of the upper gantry section suggested a massive, heavily shielded payload. The consensus estimate was that the warhead section alone was twice the size of a standard American warhead planned for the Atlas. This implied the missile was designed not just to deliver a nuclear device, but a thermonuclear device, a massive, first-generation hydrogen bomb, requiring immense shielding and volume. Booster stage larger than anything observed. The volume dedicated to the first stage, the immense, central shaft of the pit, suggested a fuel capacity far exceeding any known rocket. This indicated a staggering amount of liquid propellant, which translated directly into raw, unconstrained power. This scale was required for one reason: to compensate for the massive, heavy payload and achieve true intercontinental range. Structural rings capable of handling extreme pressures. The metal structural rings detected near the rail lines were not simple construction supports. They were the primary structural elements of the rocket itself, designed to bear the immense internal pressure of cryogenic propellants, supercooled liquid oxygen and highly volatile kerosene, and the sheer thrust of multiple clustered engines. NATO had prepared for hundreds of Soviet medium-range missiles, the weapons that could hit London or Paris. The plan was one of attrition, relying on air superiority and the depth of the alliance. But this wasn't about quantity. This was about a new category of missile, something with range, weight, or power the West hadn't considered. It was a sledgehammer designed to cross the globe, a single, decisive weapon that would change the rules of the game instantly. The analysts recognized the design philosophy. The Soviets hadn't mastered miniaturization or efficiency yet. Instead of making a smaller, lighter missile like the US was attempting, they had simply scaled up the components until the rocket was physically large enough to heave a multi-ton H-bomb to the American mainland. This brutal, pragmatic approach bypassed years of complex metallurgical research. A single spy camera, focused for a fleeting second through a tear in a camouflage sheet, had revealed a threat that could obliterate the existing balance of power. The picture was clear. The Soviet Union was not catching up. They were using their industrial might to leapfrog the competition with a weapon of sheer, unadulterated size. The Pentagon and Whitehall, London, October 1956, the 48-hour crisis. The intelligence packet, containing Frame 47E, the wireframe reconstruction, and Dr. Vance's concise report, reached the highest echelons of government in Washington and London simultaneously. The reaction was not one of reasoned debate, but of shock that quickly hardened into panic. The image was on the desks of the highest-ranking officials in Washington and London within hours. For years, these war rooms had been predicated on strategic superiority. That superiority was now visibly melting away under the scrutiny of a single photograph. The conclusions were chilling, striking at the very heart of Western defense dogma. NATO's early warning systems were outdated. The vast, expensive radar picket fences, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System (BMEWS), primarily built to detect missiles coming over the Arctic, were designed to track trajectories of known Soviet missiles. The massive, high-trajectory ICBM suggested by the silo dimensions might not follow the expected path, or its sheer size could overwhelm existing sensor filters. Furthermore, the immense size of the warhead implied a much larger, more easily detectable target, but the unexpected timing of the threat rendered the system unprepared. Submarine-based deterrence was no longer enough. The American Polaris submarine program was still in its infancy. The concept of invulnerable, sea-based retaliation was meant to be the ultimate deterrent. But if the Soviets had a weapon that could wipe out strategic land-based targets before the Polaris fleet was fully operational, the second strike would be too late. The Soviet leap meant the US was facing a temporary deterrence gap. Western missile defenses were effectively useless. The primary defense systems were based on intercepting medium-range bombers or short-range ballistic missiles like the V-2 derivatives. They had absolutely no countermeasure capable of intercepting a massive, high-speed, high-altitude ICBM. The West had gambled on having more time to develop anti-ballistic missile (ABM) defenses. That time was now gone. The realization was a swift, brutal cold shower. The Soviets, once thought to be technologically inferior in rocketry, had executed a textbook strategic surprise. General Maxwell Taylor, Army Chief of Staff, summed it up bluntly in a closed-door meeting. If this weapon becomes operational, the Soviets gain first strike leverage. They don't need to hit us. They just need to threaten us convincingly enough that we back down in every single future crisis. They gain political leverage in every single hot spot, from Berlin to Cuba, because they have the one thing we always assumed we had: sanctuary. Nobody had expected the USSR to leap this far ahead. The Soviet emphasis on massive, crude rocketry, while lacking in finesse, was paying off in raw, terrifying power. The most terrifying part of the equation was the timing. The Cyclops photograph, frame 47E, showed a complex in the final stages of construction, with vertical assembly of large components clearly underway. Nobody knew how close the missile was to completion. Was it months? Was it weeks? The intelligence report was immediately classified under the highest possible designation. The need for absolute silence was paramount. If the Soviets knew their camouflage had failed, they would change their tactics. But the American response could not wait. The photograph dictated immediate action. President Eisenhower was awakened, briefed, and immediately authorized Operation Jupiter, a massive, accelerated program to close the missile gap that had just been surgically revealed. The entire strategic focus of the Cold War, from bomber deployment to space funding, shifted irrevocably because of one tiny glint of sunlight caught on a piece of metal, 20 kilometers below a lone reconnaissance aircraft. The single image, the one that wasn't supposed to exist, had just forced the West into the greatest arms race in history. The shock was total, but the reaction was immediate and highly organized. In the closed, secure offices of the Pentagon and Whitehall, the intelligence derived from Frame 47E was codenamed Project Icarus, a nod to the hubris of the Soviets building a weapon that might burn them, and a reminder of the Western world's sudden, dramatic fall from aerial complacency. The West reacted instantly, mobilizing resources on a scale not seen since the Korean War, but with an unparalleled focus on technology and stealth. This was not a military mobilization of troops, it was a mobilization of intellect, funds, and surveillance systems. The immediate, public-facing response was a flurry of upgrades to existing defense infrastructures, designed to buy time while the strategic thinkers developed a long-term doctrine. Canadian radar sites were upgraded. The Distant Early Warning Line, DEW Line, a massive network of radar stations stretched across the Arctic Circle from Alaska to Greenland, was the West's primary defense against bomber attack. Suddenly, its capabilities were insufficient. New high-power, over-the-horizon radar arrays, which could peer beyond the curvature of the Earth, were rushed into development and deployment across the northern perimeter of North America and into the Canadian wilderness. These new systems were specifically tuned to detect the higher velocity, higher trajectory signatures of a missile, rather than the lower, slower profiles of bombers. Funding for these isolated, crucial sites tripled overnight, moving the timeline for completion up by 2 years. New interceptor programs received emergency funding. While the ICBM could not be stopped with jets, the continued threat of the Soviet long-range aviation (LRA) force remained. Programs for next-generation, high-altitude interceptors, such as the American F-106 Delta Dart, received emergency authorization and massive injections of cash. The goal was to ensure absolute air superiority over North America and Europe, eliminating any chance of the Soviets using traditional bombers as decoys or secondary strike vectors while the missile threat materialized. British listening stations increased monitoring. The network of signals intelligence (SIGINT) stations run by Britain's Government Communications Headquarters (GCHQ) was placed on maximum alert. These stations, already adept at intercepting Soviet communications, were given new priority tasking, hunting for the electromagnetic footprint of the launch complex. Analysts were instructed to look for radio traffic related to specialized liquid fuel transport, complex telemetry tests, or large, unique power consumption signatures that would betray the operational readiness of the Kazakhstan site. The focus shifted from what they are saying to what their machines are transmitting. U.S. reconnaissance doubled overnight. The missions flown by Major Miller in the RB-57D were immediately discontinued due to the extreme risk. The U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance program, already operational but highly secretive, was doubled in frequency and specifically tasked with overflights of Zone ALPHA-7. The goal was to secure multiple, continuous high-resolution images to monitor the construction progress, determine the exact size and shape of the assembled missile, and calculate the inevitable launch date. These missions, flown at the razor's edge of the Earth's atmosphere, became the most dangerous and vital flights of the entire decade. The Quiet Revolution, a new doctrine. But the biggest shift happened quietly, in the sterile, windowless offices of the RAND Corporation and other hidden think tanks. The discovery of the Soviet ICBM forced a complete intellectual overhaul of Cold War doctrine. Before Frame 47E, the strategic concept was massive retaliation, the threat of using a large bomber force to obliterate the USSR should they attack NATO in Europe. This doctrine relied entirely on the perceived physical safety of the North American continent. The ICBM erased that safety. Hidden strategists began designing a new doctrine, one that assumed the Soviets could soon deploy a missile that changed the meaning of deterrence. If the enemy could strike first with devastating force, the old rules of retaliation no longer applied. The new philosophy was termed flexible response and, more importantly, second strike capability. The realization was that the West no longer had to match the Soviet Union missile for missile, the missile gap fear. The West had to ensure that no matter what the Soviets launched, enough retaliatory force would survive to be launched back. This meant hardening command structures, placing ICBMs in underground silos, which was immediately accelerated for the U.S. Minuteman program, and rapidly deploying the sea-based deterrent Polaris submarines, which were undetectable. From that moment on, the Cold War stopped being about how many weapons each side had, the quantity of bombs and planes, and became a race for who could detect the other first. The currency of power shifted from steel and explosive yield to information and surveillance latency. The key question became, can we see it coming, and can our retaliatory decision be made before the first warhead lands? This singular photograph triggered the massive investment in satellite intelligence, infrared detection, and the high-speed data networks necessary for instant strategic decisions. The entire infrastructure of the modern intelligence community, from the vast listening antennae to the supercomputers, was fundamentally rooted in the panic of October 1956. The IDEC Type 60 spy camera, the Cyclops, flew only a handful of subsequent missions before being replaced by satellites, the inevitable technological successor that its own data helped fund. Its high-resolution images, invaluable as they were simply too risky to acquire. The loss of over Soviet territory in 1960 would later confirm the extreme danger of manned, high-altitude flights. But intelligence historians still agree, no other image in the entire Cold War had such an immediate, irreversible, and strategic effect. The photograph, Frame 47E, did several things simultaneously. It exposed a Soviet program the West had no idea existed. The U.S. had assumed that the Soviet Union, having prioritized manned bombers and short-range missiles, was years away from ICBM capability. The photograph showed that Soviet industrial might, focused with brutal priority, could achieve a massive strategic leap. The missile, later confirmed to be the R-7 Semyorka, was indeed larger than any contemporary American design and capable of hitting the U.S. mainland. The entire intelligence community had been blindsided. It forced NATO to rebuild its strategy from the ground up. The transition from massive retaliation to assured destruction, MAD, was predicated on the fear introduced by the R-7. MAD required both sides to be equally vulnerable, and the R-7 ensured that vulnerability was shared. The photo forced NATO to shift its reliance from vulnerable airbases to hardened silos and, crucially, to the invulnerable, silent force of the ballistic missile submarine fleet. It pushed both sides into the fastest escalation of technological innovation. The discovery initiated the frantic, expensive race to miniaturize warheads, to put them on smaller, solid-fuel missiles like Minuteman, to develop satellite reconnaissance, the KH series of spy satellites, and to create the high-speed command and control systems that defined the next 2 decades. The legacy of the Cyclops camera is not its technical specifications, but its timing. It delivered the one piece of information the West needed most, right before the Soviets could launch their first orbital test and claim global psychological victory. When the Soviets finally launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite, in October 1957, the propaganda victory was immense. The world watched in awe as the beeping sphere passed overhead, proof of Soviet rocket power. But in the secure war rooms of NATO, there was no panic. There was only grim confirmation. They had known this day was coming. They had known for a year. The R-7 missile that launched Sputnik was the same missile that was under construction in Frame 47E. The fear had already been processed. The plans had already been drawn. The funding had already been spent. The strategic response had been baked in. One frame, one flash of reflected sunlight, one camera that saw what no one else could. The day a single spy camera changed the entire balance of the Cold War was the day the world realized that in the age of rocketry, the most powerful weapon was not the warhead itself, but the clarity of the intelligence that revealed it.